Lucas Miller was just 19 when his stepmother, Helen, crossed a line that would shatter their family forever. What began as subtle manipulation turned into a forbidden affair and ended with a staged accident, a dead father, and a courtroom full of secrets. By the time the truth surfaced, Evergreen Hills would never feel safe again. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Evergreen Hills, the Miller house stood like any other. A pale blue two-story with white shutters, a small porch, swing, and a neatly trimmed lawn. It blended in perfectly, drawing no special attention. To the neighbors, the family seemed ordinary. David Miller, a hard-working logistics manager, his second wife Helen, a nurse with a calming smile, and Lucas, David's teenage son from his previous marriage. After Lucas's mother passed away in a car accident, David struggled to hold the family together. A year later, Helen entered their lives, bringing a much-needed sense of structure and warmth. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. Helen had met David through a grief support group. She was compassionate and knew the right words to say, which drew David in quickly. They married within 10 months. Lucas, then 17, was quiet during the ceremony, his face stiff and unreadable. He didn't protest the marriage, but he never quite accepted it either. In time, though, the three developed a workable rhythm. Helen took over the household routines, cooking, cleaning, organizing. She made a noticeable effort with Lucas, helping with his college applications, buying him books, and attending school meetings in David's place whenever work pulled him away. To outsiders, they were healing. But inside that house, lines were quietly beginning to blur. David's job kept him away for days at a time. His absences grew longer, and Helen filled the space he left behind. She and Lucas began spending more time together, watching movies, taking late evening walks, even doing weekly grocery runs as a duo. At first, it seemed like a healthy connection forming between a stepmother and her stepson. But over time, their interactions became more intimate. Helen would touch Lucas's shoulder for a little too long. Her compliments sounded less maternal, more flirtatious. Lucas, confused and lonely, didn't know how to react. Sometimes he would pull away. Sometimes he didn't. By the time Lucas turned 19, he had finished his first year at a local college and decided to stay home for the summer. It was during that time that the relationship between him and Helen shifted further. The distance between them narrowed to whispers behind closed doors and long glances across the dinner table. Helen's attachment to Lucas deepened into something that no longer resembled care. It was possessive, even obsessive. She began inserting herself into every part of his life. She discouraged him from going out with friends. She asked invasive questions about the girls he spoke to. When David returned home from business trips, Helen seemed distracted, almost irritated by his presence. Neighbors began noticing odd behavior. Lucas and Helen were often seen together at odd hours, walking side by side, their closeness resembling that of a couple more than family. The town gossip wheel turned slowly at first, but eventually questions were raised, none loud enough to reach the police, but just enough to create unease. What no one saw was how much control Helen had gained over Lucas. She presented herself as his confidant, the only person who truly understood him. Lucas, already grieving his mother and emotionally neglected by his distant father, clung to the one person who showed him consistent attention, even if it felt wrong. Behind the neatly painted walls of the Miller home, trust was being twisted into dependency. What started as comfort turned into secrecy. And all the while, David remained unaware. He was still operating under the belief that Helen was a blessing, a second chance at a normal family life. But beneath the surface, something darker was growing. Something that would soon shatter everything he thought he had rebuilt. The summer heat in Evergreen Hills was thick and still, the kind that clung to the skin and slowed everything down. Inside the Miller home, time seemed to crawl. David was away on another week-long trip, and Lucas had the house almost entirely to himself, except for Helen, who had now grown into something more than just a presence in his life. Her interest in him was no longer subtle. She no longer tiptoed around the boundaries that separated motherly care from emotional intrusion. Those lines had vanished, and Lucas, young and impressionable, found himself drifting into a world that felt both exciting and wrong. That IT started with her showing up in his room late at night, offering to help with his assignments, lingering too long, brushing against him under the pretense of accidental contact. Her compliments became more personal, fixated on his appearance, on how mature he'd become. She cooked his favorite meals, left small gifts in his backpack, and even began referring to him as her only one. Lucas didn't fully understand what was happening at first. He was conflicted, wrapped in guilt and confusion. She was his stepmother, and yet the way she looked at him no longer resembled anything close to maternal affection. It felt obsessive. Helen began to manipulate his emotions in subtle ways. When Lucas tried to spend time with friends, she feigned illness. When he talked about dating, her mood would shift instantly. Her voice would drop, her demeanor would turn cold. She made him feel like he owed her something, like being with her was a form of repayment for all she had done for him. Slowly, he stopped seeing his friends. His world grew smaller, tighter, revolving around Helen and the carefully crafted reality she built around them. Lucas started skipping classes. He stayed home more often, shut in with Helen, lost in the warped connection they shared. Helen became territorial, possessive, and emotionally manipulative. She told him things like they were soulmates, that what they had was pure and misunderstood by the outside world. She painted David as the villain, absent, emotionally unavailable, and undeserving of the family he had. She told Lucas that David never truly cared, that he only worked to avoid his responsibilities at home. That as the weeks passed, Helen's behavior grew more erratic. She began locking her phone, closing doors quietly when David called, and deleting browser histories with paranoid precision. She no longer tried to hide her jealousy when Lucas mentioned girls from school. She accused him of betraying her, of being ungrateful. Lucas, overwhelmed, began pulling away, but not far enough. He still lived under the same roof. He still depended on her emotionally. And Helen sensed that distance growing, which only fueled her desperation. One night, she spoke vaguely about a future without David. Not a divorce, not a separation, something more permanent. She used words like freedom and starting fresh. Lucas tried to laugh it off, but her expression never changed. Her eyes were distant, calculating. He realized then that what he had taken as unhealthy affection had evolved into something far more dangerous. He became quiet around her. He started locking his bedroom door at night, something he had never done before. He resumed contact with his old friends, tried to reconnect with a girl he once liked. Helen noticed. She became colder, moodier, her smiles disappearing. Lucas didn't know how to end what had started. He was trapped, physically in the home, emotionally in the web she had spun. He thought about telling David, but feared he wouldn't be believed. Helen had always been careful, always painted herself as the loving stepmother. If Lucas said anything, it would be his word against hers. But deep inside, he knew something was building. Helen wasn't just possessive. She was dangerous. And whatever she was planning, it wasn't going to stop at emotional control. That David's early return home was unexpected. A delayed shipment in Denver had forced the cancellation of a key meeting, and he decided to take the opportunity to surprise his family. It was late when he walked through the front door. The house was quiet, lights dimmed, and the air felt off. Something was different. Lucas's bedroom door was closed and locked, which wasn't unusual in itself, but the faint creak of floorboards down the hallway suggested someone else was still awake. David called out, but received no answer. He let it go for the night, attributing the odd atmosphere to travel fatigue. But the next morning, he noticed it again. Helen seemed tense, jumpy even. Lucas avoided his eyes, offering short replies, disappearing into his room at every opportunity. David tried to ignore it, but his instincts told him something was wrong. Over the next few days, the feeling only grew stronger. Helen was overly attentive, almost robotic in her affection. Lucas, on the other hand, looked exhausted. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes shadowed by something heavier than lack of sleep. David began noticing odd things. Helen's phone never left her side anymore. Grocery bills seemed higher than usual for a family of three, and Lucas's class attendance reports showed multiple unexcused absences. Still, David said nothing. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. But the unease gnawed at him. He began to observe more closely. He asked casual questions about Lucas's routine, checked the security camera logs he'd installed months earlier. After a break-in scare, and even reviewed call records on the family phone plan. Something didn't add up. His son's behavior didn't match the stories Helen told. And when David found a receipt for a motel stay tucked between couch cushions, dated during one of his recent work trips, his concern turned to suspicion. Instead of confronting either of them, David decided to gather more evidence. He set up 2 discrete cameras inside the house, one in the living room, another in the hallway. He told no one. Over the next week, he watched from his hotel room. While away, reviewing footage each night. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Helen and Lucas were too close, too familiar. They would sit on the couch together long after midnight, sometimes curled under the same blanket, speaking in whispers. One night, Helen emerged from Lucas's bedroom well past 2 a.m. David returned home without announcing it. He said nothing to either of them, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But something inside him had shifted. He started sleeping in the guest room. He became cold, withdrawn, and preoccupied. Helen noticed. So did Lucas. The fragile balance inside the house began to unravel. Helen knew David was watching. She could sense it. Her behavior turned paranoid. She started erasing her steps more carefully, deleting messages, cleaning obsessively, checking door locks over and over. She realized her fantasy of controlling Lucas was slipping. Worse, Lucas had begun pulling away, avoiding her, spending time outside the house, and speaking less. When she pressed him, he looked at her with a mix of fear and disgust. Helen felt cornered. In her mind, David was the root of the problem. If he was gone, things could return to the way they were. Just her and Lucas, no guilt, no threat of exposure. That thought became an obsession. She began searching for ways to end it, all without raising suspicion. She researched sleeping pills, forged a prescription under David's name, and slowly began tampering with his medications. Then she crafted a plan, emails written to sound like David, expressing stress and hopelessness, text messages scheduled, and sent to his own phone to simulate mental decline. She was methodical, cold, calculated. Lucas sensed something was happening but didn't know the extent of it. He only knew that Helen had grown eerily calm again, like a storm right before it breaks. And in her silence, in her carefully measured actions, a deadly plan was already unfolding. The call came in just after dawn on a Wednesday morning. A car had been discovered at the bottom of a steep ravine off a rarely traveled service road just outside Evergreen Hills. It was crushed, twisted among the rocks and trees, almost unrecognizable. Inside, the body of a man was found slumped over the steering wheel. The engine was cold. There were no skid marks, no signs of impact with another vehicle. Just a fatal descent, as if the car had quietly drifted off the edge. Identification confirmed what no one wanted to believe. It was David Miller. Authorities initially ruled it a tragic accident. David had a demanding job, long drives, and recent stress. The steep road had no guardrail, and the curve was sharp, easy to miss in the dark. The toxicology report revealed traces of sedatives in his system, But given his prescription history, it raised no red flags. Helen cried publicly, clinging to Lucas, her grief loud and raw. She gave emotional interviews, speaking about David's dedication to his family, the pain of loss, and the fragility of life. Friends and neighbors showed up with casseroles, flowers, and condolences. The town mourned a man they barely knew but respected from a distance. Lucas, however, wasn't mourning in the same way. He looked hollow at the funeral. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was mechanical. Something in him had broken. He hadn't seen the plan form entirely, but in hindsight, he recognized the signs. The sudden calm in Helen's demeanor, the precision with which she moved in the days before David's death, the way she took over the aftermath with such chilling control, handling paperwork, fielding questions, planning the service down to the last detail. Lucas knew, even if he couldn't prove it, that Helen had orchestrated everything. 3 weeks passed. Life began settling back into its old patterns, but a quiet tension remained in the house. Lucas stayed out longer, barely eating at home, locking his bedroom door every night. Helen tried to bring him back into her orbit, cooking his favorite meals, leaving notes on his door, buying him expensive gifts with the life insurance money. But Lucas wasn't responding. Her control over him was slipping, and she felt it. She had eliminated David, but in doing so, she had broken something she couldn't repair. Then came the anonymous tip to the police. Just one line delivered through the department's online reporting portal. She made it look like an accident. Investigators reopened the case quietly, revisiting the coroner's report and analyzing inconsistencies. The dosage of sedatives in David's system was abnormally high, enough to severely impair motor function, not just cause drowsiness. Surveillance footage from nearby highway cameras showed David's car heading toward the area hours before the crash, but failed to capture it returning, nor did any footage place him near the service road. Forensic analysts reviewed David's emails and found several strange messages written in a tone that didn't match his usual communication. Metadata revealed the messages were sent from inside the house, while David was supposedly away. When police secured a warrant and searched the Miller home, they uncovered the final piece. Hidden in a password-protected folder on Helen's computer was a collection of disturbing content, journal entries describing her resentment toward David, fantasies of a future with Lucas, and a detailed plan that eerily resembled the exact circumstances of David's death. What had once looked like a tragic accident was now undeniably premeditated murder. Helen was arrested in broad daylight as she returned home from a local bookstore. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as officers led her away in handcuffs. She didn't cry or scream. She didn't speak. She only looked at Lucas through the window as they placed her in the squad car. Her face held no fear, only disappointment, as if he had betrayed her, and Lucas, still standing at the window, realized that what had died that day in the ravine wasn't just his father. It was the last remaining illusion of safety in his life. The courtroom was packed with reporters, locals, and curious onlookers who had followed every detail of the shocking case. Helen Miller sat silently at the defense table, dressed in plain beige, her expression unreadable. Her once carefully curated image as the devoted wife and stepmother had completely unraveled. Now she was something else in the public eye, a manipulator, a predator, and a murderer. The trial began with cold, hard facts: the forged emails, the tampered medication, the suspicious search history. But what held the courtroom in stunned silence was the true motive that emerged: a twisted obsession with her own stepson, Lucas. Was the prosecution's key witness. He looked thinner than before, pale and gaunt, his voice steady but empty as he took the stand. He described the gradual manipulation, the emotional entanglement, the inappropriate closeness that began after his mother's death. He admitted he had been confused, scared, and too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening. But the most damning moment came when he revealed the night Helen had first suggested that his father was in the way, that maybe life would be better without David. That moment made everything else fall into place for the jury. That Helen's defense argued diminished capacity, claiming that she had been mentally unwell, that her actions were not those of a calculating killer, but of a woman overwhelmed by grief, loneliness, and unresolved trauma. They painted her as fragile, misunderstood, someone who simply lost control. But the evidence told a different story, one of deliberate planning, emotional manipulation, and lethal intent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder and criminal endangerment. Helen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no reaction when the sentence was read, only stared ahead as if none of it applied to her. Her final words to the court were strange and chilling. She said she had done what love demanded, and that if given the chance, she would not change a thing. Those words echoed in the courtroom long after she was led away. For Lucas, the trial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another far more difficult one. He withdrew from college, stopped responding to friends, and eventually left Evergreen Hills without telling anyone where he was going. Some believed he moved across the country, changing his name and starting over. Others speculated he entered treatment for trauma. In truth, no one really knew. The boy who had once walked the quiet streets of Evergreen Hills vanished, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions. The Miller home was sold within months. A new family moved in, repainting the walls and planting fresh flowers in the yard. But the neighbors never looked at that house the same way again. It stood as a quiet monument to a story that shattered their illusion of safety. People spoke in hushed tones about what happened, often shaking their heads, still unable to believe that something so dark had taken place just next door. In the end, the story of Helen and Lucas became something more than just a headline. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked control, blurred boundaries, and the silence that allows manipulation to thrive. A reminder that even in the safest seeming families, evil can take root, slowly, quietly, until it's too late to stop. And when it finally breaks through the surface, the damage it leaves behind is often far worse than anyone imagined.